Well, discouragement is something that can affect us all in different ways. You try to do something, it doesn't work out, and it can be discouraging then to think about trying again. Because you think, well, I failed the first time, is it going to happen again the next time? It can happen in all sorts of situations in life. Very discouraging when people are applying for a job, and they try for many job applications, and they get letters back perhaps saying, well, thank you for your application, but on this occasion you're unsuccessful. And although they may have kind words and words to try and help you, the discouragement can build up after a period of time. The letters of rejection, in effect. It can happen, people trying their driving test, trying it a few times and failing and being discouraged at that. And then there can be in relationships as well. People can be discouraged by words that are said to them. Perhaps they are disparaging words spoken by a husband to a wife that can reduce self-esteem to be able to complete certain tasks. So there are these scenarios in life where discouragement can be very real. And discouragement can come into the Christian way as well, and into the Christian race or the Christian pilgrimage, however you want to describe it. And there's a sense in which the writer to the Hebrews was trying to deal with that kind of discouragement in those to whom he was writing. And I want to look at that theme this evening, the theme of discouragement, and how that writer tried to help those to whom he was writing, these Hebrew Christians, as they're described to us in the letter to the Hebrews. So first of all, I want to think about sources of discouragement. Sources of discouragement. What are these sources of discouragement? Well, as the writer begins to describe Jesus, who's going to be able to help them, obviously we're going to come on to think about that, as he describes the help that Jesus is able to give, in a way, he is highlighting for us those reasons or those areas that can become a discouragement for them and for believers in any age. So one of those sources of discouragement is weakness, weaknesses. He speaks about this in chapter 4 and in verse 15, weaknesses. So you might think about perhaps a sports person who particularly has to maybe do a marathon or has some long challenge. At the end of this month, there is planned the annual Tour de France bike race where teams compete over a period of 3 weeks, covering thousands of miles. And they may face a sense of weakness, perhaps on a daily basis, maybe. Can they achieve what they're meant to be doing? So it can be a real thing for sports people, where they have a sense of weakness that can hinder them and potentially discourage them. And these Christians, these Hebrew Christians, clearly had a sense of weakness as well in being able to persevere and to continue in their faith. Weakness perhaps to listen, weakness perhaps to obey, weakness perhaps in continuing on the path. And maybe weakness as well in terms of expectations. The expectation that they should be growing, the expectation that they should be bearing fruit. And that can be true of us as well. We are meant to be those who bear fruit. We're meant to be those who are growing. But we may be conscious of our weakness in that. I can come back to the message this morning that we're thinking about being imitators. We may feel we're so weak in that aspect, so weak in terms of being a model and being an example. And we can become discouraged then by that sense of weakness. So that's one source of discouragement. And then another source of discouragement is temptation. And the writer to the Hebrews is aware of this as well, speaking about being tempted as we are, he says. He includes himself in that. We don't know who he was, but he includes himself and identifies with those to whom he is writing. And here we are as Christian believers, disciples of Jesus Christ, who are following in his path and have taken upon themselves to follow the way of Christ, Christian pathway, to go that way, to follow, to be obedient, to live for him. And yet finding that that's not so easy, that there are temptations and the reality of temptation, how easy it is to become distracted and drawn away from that. You think of a child perhaps who's given an errand to do by the parent, and they say, well, go to the shop and get this, that, and the other. And remember, come back here straight away. And yet perhaps meets a friend on the way and gets distracted and goes in another direction, tempted to go stray away. Temptation. And then on top of that, we can say failure as well. So not just weakness, not just temptation, but actual failure. Sins that become things that seem to be like shackles, that we think, can I be free of these things? Are they always going to be around me? Failure. And these things are all mentioned then in this first portion here, chapter 4. He speaks about weaknesses. In verse 15, he speaks about temptation. In verse 15, and he speaks about sin as well in verse 15, failure in so many ways. And later on in this letter, he speaks about something else that could become a discouragement for us. In chapter 10, he speaks about the reality of a guilty conscience. A guilty conscience. Guilty conscience that can cause us to draw back perhaps and feel that we can't draw near to God ever again. Sources of discouragement. And maybe we all know of these to a greater or lesser degree, perhaps at different times in our situation as we seek to live Christian lives. So the second thing then is thinking about a solution to discouragement. And this is what our writer is trying to do for these believers, these Hebrew Christians. What is his solution? First of all, just want to say two things that he doesn't do to try and help, things that you might think could be used as a solution. The first thing is he doesn't minimize these problems. So here are believers who feel their weakness. Here are believers who know the reality of temptation. Here are believers who've known what it is to fail. Here are believers who have a sense of a guilty conscience, but he doesn't minimize them. He doesn't say, well, don't worry about these things. Forget about your weaknesses. He doesn't say, well, other people have failed. You're not the only one. Others have failed in a worse way. those are not really solutions that can help at all. They may seem to be superficially ways of trying to help and trying to encourage, but they don't really get to the heart of things. They don't really help us in any meaningful way. So he doesn't minimize the problems at all and these issues. They are there. But the other thing that he doesn't do is to try to instill some sense of, well, you can do better, or you can try harder, or try to instill some sense of self-confidence. Personally, I'm always a bit wary of programs on TV where different ones say, well, if you only apply yourself to this, you can achieve anything. Sometimes they're aimed at young people to say, well, you know, you can dream big and nothing to stop you achieving these things. I mean, I was never going to play for Wales in the front row, no matter how much I might have tried. Those who'd been in school with me would have just fallen about laughing if that idea had been put to me to say, well, you know, build up your confidence, you can do it, it's possible for anybody. It's not going to work. And if we think about that in spiritual terms, just think about Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformer. He was somebody who, in a way, tried this solution in the face of a guilty conscience. He tried everything. He applied himself, he worked harder, he did more efforts religiously, morally, in every way. And he went to the head of his the monastery in which he found himself, pouring out his heart about all of this. And the head of the monastery was a wise man. And he knew that that was not going to be the path that would work for him. It's not going to be the way for us either. So those are things that he doesn't do by way of giving a solution to help Christians in any age with these sources of discouragement to help us on our way. So what does he do? Well, he points them, and he would point us to Jesus. And it occurred to me that there's a sense in which throughout this letter, the writer is doing that all the way through, really. He's pointing people to Jesus. And so what does he say about Jesus particularly? I want to highlight two things. First of all, he wants us to know who he is, who Jesus is. That might seem a bit of an obvious thing to say, but Jesus is described in various ways, even in this letter. But in this passage that we're looking at here, he's highlighted as being the great high priest, the great high priest. And in chapter 5 and in verse 1, the writer here is moving back and forth between thinking about the high priest in the temple and Jesus as the great high priest. So he makes an important point about the role of a high priest that would have spoken so powerfully to these Hebrew Christians. He reminds them that every high priest is appointed to represent them in matters related to God. And that's what they needed to hear. They needed to know that there was somebody who was on their side, basically. Somebody who was for them, on their side, representing them in matters related to God. Because the things we've been thinking about are matters related to God. Weakness in terms of being able to continue on the Christian path. Temptation that hinders us. Failure to go that way. A guilty conscience. So we need somebody who can help us in these things. And these things all relate to a relationship with God. So he points us to Jesus and first of all tells us, reminds us about who he is, who he is. And he reminds us of the glory of Jesus as a great high priest by telling us two things about him. He's the Son of God. He's the Son of God. That wasn't true of any other high priest. And surely that's one of the reasons why Jesus is the great high priest. There were other high priests, but he's the only great high priest. And he's great because he is the Son of God. And also because he is a man as well. Those two things joined together make him a great high priest that puts all of the others in the shade, and he shines above them all. If you like, this is his CV that the writer is putting before us. He wants them to be no doubt that he is fully qualified to do his role, to have his job. And the writer makes that point in chapter 5 and in verse 8, because we might be tempted to think that, well, can he really do this job? He is the Son of God after all. But notice verse 8 of chapter 5, although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. He learned obedience. He went the path that would face temptation, that would face weakness. He went along that path. And he was, the writer says here, made perfect. And we just need to be careful with that little phrase, made perfect. We might think, well, if he was made perfect, there must have been something that wasn't quite right with him beforehand. Well, what the writer's getting at him here is that he was fully qualified by having that added experience of going through temptation and knowing what it was to live in the human body. If I can put it a bit like this, there are people who qualify as, let's say, teachers or pharmacists. They have their degree. So they've got the degree, and yet they then have to go through if you like, a probationary year. And that probationary year is going to give them the experience. There's a sense in which they haven't had the full exposure to the experience of being in the classroom, dealing with the children on their own, and likewise, say, in the pharmacy, being in that sort of work. And so they have to be exposed to that and all the challenges that go with that. And at the end of their probationary year, they are fully qualified to be able to undertake their job and their work. And so it was with Jesus. Son of God became man and entered into our experience, tempted in every way, as the writer says here. That was necessary for him to be fully qualified and to know about weaknesses. And so he is made this great high priest. So that's the first thing, to know who he is. He says this is the solution to your discouragement, to know who your great high priest is. To know who he is, and also, I would say, to know where he is as well, where he is. And the writer makes a big matter of this. Chapter 4, verse 14, we have a great high priest, that's one thing, but he has gone through the heavens. He has gone through the heavens. And later on in this letter, he'll highlight the importance of that. He says in chapter 9 and verse 11, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not man-made, that is to say, not a part of this creation. So The priests of this temple, of this earth, work in what are, after all, just copies, he says, of this greater heavenly temple, if you like. And that is where Jesus is, in that place, seated at the right hand of the place of authority and power. And he is there to represent his people in matters related to God. And that makes the difference, because he is there with the Father and with the Spirit. Not in an earthly tabernacle, he is in the place of authority. I can put it a bit like this. We elect MPs, and these MPs represent their constituents. And they do that in Parliament. And there might be a particular issue, perhaps, that arises in a constituency. There could be something that comes up in the Bridgend constituency. And the MP might speak on it if he has the opportunity in Parliament, and brings the matter before those gathered there. But how different it would be if the Prime Minister said to the MP, well, why don't you come along to the next cabinet meeting that we have? Highly unusual. The MPs wouldn't normally be invited into the cabinet room. But imagine that happening, actually being able to present the case to the gathered ministers and the Prime Minister, where the policy decisions are arrived at. And so Jesus Christ, our great high priest, is in that cabinet office, if you like. He is the solution to our weakness, temptation. He is in the place of authority. So that's what he wants us to do, this writer. Look to Jesus. Remember who is representing you. So my third thing is to think then about the support. We've thought about the source of discouragement. We've seen the solution. We don't look at ourselves. We don't seek to muster things up. We don't seek to downplay things. Instead, we look to somebody who is able to help us. So what then is the support that our great high priest is able to give to us? And I've got 4 things I want to mention. And the first thing that the writer mentions here is that he is able to sympathize. He's able to sympathize. Now, he could not have done this were he not the great high priest that we just thought about, the Son of God who learned obedience, who was fully qualified. He would not be able to help us had he not had that experience, if he were not the person that he is, even now. So he's able to sympathize, the writer says to us in verse 15 of chapter 4. We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. This is one of the marvels of the incarnation, that the Son of God from all eternity is able to sympathize with our weaknesses, because he was in a body as our body that knew hunger and thirst and pain and all the things that could generate physical and emotional weakness. It's a wonder that these things are true of him. The Father does not know those things, but the Son does, and he is fully qualified and fully able to represent us and help us in this way. He has experienced then, if you like, a source of our discouragement by knowing what it is to be in a body that can feel that weakness. Now, people can't always sympathize with you in your circumstance. It can be difficult to enter into other people's experience. It happens at election times when people sometimes complain that politicians don't know what it's like to live on benefits or universal credit. They can't sympathize with people in that situation. During the Second World War, even, at one point in the Second World War, the then Queen came in for criticism when she went to the East End of London, because the people there didn't feel that she could truly sympathize with their situation as it was then. Things changed later, and they came to respect and admire the tenacity of the King and Queen at the time. But initially, that wasn't the case, and there was a lot of coolness in that regard, not able to sympathize. Well, the writer says, we have in Jesus Christ, this Son of God, this Son of Man, one who is able to sympathize with us. And secondly, so the second support he is able to give to us is that he is able to deal gently as well with us. Now, I'm taking this from chapter 5 and verse 2, where initially the writer is talking about the earthly high priest. He is able to deal gently with those. Well, it's certainly true of our Lord Jesus Christ. Matthew, in his gospel, writes and says of the Lord Jesus that he doesn't break a bruised reed, that he doesn't quench, extinguish the smoking flax. And Jesus speaks of himself as being gentle and humble in spirit. How different he was from many of the religious leaders of his day who were harsh. And that harsh spirit and that critical spirit constantly expressed itself in their words and in their attitudes. How different was and is our great high priest, who is able to deal gently with us in our situation. So that's the second support that we're able to have from our great high priest. And the third thing is daily help, because we need help on a daily basis from our great high priest. And this is put in two ways in verse 16 of chapter 4. We're able to receive mercy. And yes, when we fail as sinners, we need mercy. And he is merciful. And he is a merciful high priest for us. And he's also one who's able to give us grace to help in our time of need. Grace is a gift. Essentially, that's what the word means. It's a gift. And how many times people have been thankful for the grace of God. We sing a hymn, don't we, from time to time, how the grace of God amazes me. It's a grace that saves us in the first place. It's a grace that keeps us. It's the grace that is able to sustain us. The Apostle Paul was told, my grace is sufficient for you. He found the challenge, he found the weakness in his own flesh. We don't know what that was, but the word came, my grace is sufficient for you. Daily help is the third support that our Lord is able to give to us. And then the fourth thing the great thing I touched on earlier in quoting verse 9 of chapter 5, that is able to really keep our eyes to the end, is that he has become the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. The priests in the days of these Hebrew Christians were only able to minister for a period of time. And the sacrifices that they offered were only effective for a period of time. Every day there were sacrifices being offered on the altar in the temple, and the smoke would rise. And once a year there was the great sacrifice in the Holy of Holies, but even that came round every year, over and over again. But our writer is saying that what sets him apart, our great high priest, is that he's procured, we might say, a great salvation, a source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. He has paid the price. Later on, this writer is going to be able to say that he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. Eternal redemption. Redemption brings up that idea of paying a price, clearing a debt, paying a debt, all the failures, all the failure to live in a right way. Debt is a thing that I suppose most people have faced in some way in their lives, even if it's just taking out a mortgage. It's a debt that you have, and it has to be paid. And you pay the interest, you pay the capital perhaps, but the debt is still there. And until it's cleared, the debt remains. But what this writer is saying, that the debt has been paid. Christ has paid it all. And this surely is the greatest support for us, to know that in the face of failure, in the face of sin, there is an eternal salvation that is once and for all. So discouragement will always come, and discouragement can be helped. And whether we are facing discouragement now or not, we can be sure that there will be times that will come to us in some way or another, as these readers or these believers found. But when that is the case, we look to Christ. We see him as the source to our discouragement. We remember who he is, remember where he is, and draw help from the support that he is able to give to us. That's why this writer says, well then, when we come to God in prayer, when we come to him, let's come with confidence, not discouraged, but with confidence, because we know the one to whom we're coming. Let's put our trust in him. Let's draw our support from him. Amen.